Amazing. Hi, I just want to introduce myself. Who you are? Adam, what's the mission?
Relationship.
I am executive for Civic. Yes. I will tell everybody about it. I will tell everybody about it, so I want to just meet everybody with this people. I'm going to be here all night, so that's it. Thanks so much for coming. Hi, I'm Laura. Thanks for coming. Hi, I'm Laura. And how'd you guys we go from or was a friend of mine and writing up some stuff for them. So feel free to ask them for books or
that's a good question.
Makes sense. Hi, I'm Laura. Where do you have Oh, good. I'm glad you did that. That's fantastic. Okay, so yeah, I know somebody else who's right? And Asbed. I just want to introduce you. Sorry, Adam. Sorry, Asbed.
Well, thank you for being here.
So, you guys got to do this.
Of course, it's not that popular in Bentley University. You're releasing some more power.
Meant to be, a conversation, and she made me invite her. So I invite you to come on up. And I invite you too, Adam, to come on up. Yes, absolutely, because there's nothing else. I invite you too.
It's an invitation.
Oh, wonderful. Let's do that. Yeah, this is the first time I'm having a show.
Yes, absolutely. First hour.
Hey, hello everybody. Hi. And hello to all the people in the back. I don't know if you're with us or not, but I'm going to speak to you anyway, as if you were. Okay, so my name is Lar. And I am the curator of the Civic Series. The Civic Series has been a passion project of mine since 2010. And I worked really hard on getting it launched in 2010, and then nothing happened for 3 years. And then I restarted here in WorkBar with the amazing help from people like Abby and Alexa and other WorkBar member staff who let us have this space for free. So pretty much my story is, I just felt, after a while, I just felt really sick and tired of feeling dumb about not knowing what's going on in the world. And as Asbed told me, I'm not dumb, right, obviously, I'm just uninformed. And then I've had hundreds of conversations with people over the past 4 years about this topic, and everyone keeps saying the same things, right? I'm not apathetic. I actually care, I want to know. There are just a lot of barriers to me actually understanding. And there aren't really many places where you can go to where you can get a basic background information about what's going on, about topics that things that are happening in the world, current events. Things like, what's going on in Syria, the Ukraine, Russia, and Iraq. And then also things like, the U.S. immigration and healthcare and the economy and things like that. So the Civic Series are a series of sessions, and each one is intended to provide you basic background information about what's going on in current events and issues like this. So this event is really about you. It's about what's of interest to you. It's about what you want to know. It's about what questions you have. So Asbed's going to give a presentation. I'll introduce him in just a moment. And then we're going to have like an open forum where you can ask your questions, and there'll be kind of a discussion afterwards. So the rule here is obviously the basic, don't cut people off and be polite and things like that. But then also the rule that Sean actually proposed for our first Civic Series session, this is just number 2, is there are no dumb questions. Like really, there are no dumb questions. And I will volunteer to be the dumbest person in the room. And I'll actually, if Asbed says something that I think that I don't understand, or I think someone else might not understand, I'm going to be like, hey, can you just clarify what that means? Because not everybody might know what that means. And you're welcome to do that too. Okay, so it's a safe space.
It's another issue you might answer.
It's
another issue I might not answer.
You might not answer.
You can answer.
That's right.
No.
That's great. So a couple of things. So we're definitely going to wrap up for 7:30. And last time we scheduled it for an hour, and it went extra 40 minutes, which is why I scheduled it for a little bit longer. And we'll kind of see how the conversation goes based on that. Also, hopefully everyone checked in with Sean over here. Just want to make sure that we keep track of who attends and our numbers and stuff. I actually got a finalist in the pitch competition for when it's happening on Wednesday. We're going to share the Civic Series with a number of entrepreneurs inside of Boston who can help support this and grow this. It's a nonprofit project. It's going to stay a nonprofit project, but hopefully have it reach other cities as well rather than just Boston. So numbers and testimonials and quotes and things like this are really, really helpful for things like that. In fact, we actually already have a Civic Series happening in Toronto, and that's starting this Thursday. So it's kind of neat how it's grown. The last thing I want to say before I introduce our speaker is we also have a bunch of surveys, and I'm hoping every single one of you can fill out, and it's like a less than a minute long survey. Just fill it on out, hand it over to Sean. Again, super, super helpful for us. Okay, great. So without anything further to say, I'll introduce our speaker. So Professor Asbed Kotchikian is a senior lecturer at the Global Studies Department at Bentley University, where he teaches courses on the Middle East and former Soviet Union. Over the last 10 years, Dr. Kotchikian has traveled extensively and lived in the Middle East and former Soviet Union. He has written, lectured, presented, and organized conferences on questions of identity and transformation of transnational groups, foreign policies of small and weak states, national identity, and regional developments in the Middle East and Eurasia. He has a book called The Dialectics of Small States, Foreign Policy Making in Armenia and Georgia, and was published in 2008, and he's currently the editor of the academic peer-reviewed journal Armenian Review. And if anyone is tweeting, we're at Civic Series. Okay, that's all. It's yours.
Yep. Thank you for being here. When Laura first contacted me about 2 weeks ago, 2 months ago, about the project, I found it fascinating. We talked about it. I was actually thinking of working or presenting on Syria back then, but I was traveling in Morocco. I have the unfortunate or the fortunate sort of honor or curse to work on two areas that seem to be in a mess. I used to teach the Middle East for 10 years. I didn't need to change anything in the department. Same leaders, nothing has changed. And suddenly 3 years ago, everything. I need to keep up with everything. The same thing goes with the former Soviet space, although changes there are more are slower. Just in case, by the way, before going in, if anyone's following the World Cup, Brazil and Mexico made it to the qualifying games. And Croatia lost. I'm not a big fan, a football fan, soccer fan, but I do follow the World Cup. So basically, what we're going to do here today, is provide a background, understanding what it is, what the problems are. But for that, we need to have a background. I always tell my students that in order to talk about an issue, for you to be able to put it in context, you need to know the history. History matters, and a lot of issues, a lot of problems come in history. We find the roots in history. Now, let me ask a question, and be honest. Again, there is no we're not too graded or anything. How many of you think that you can identify where Ukraine is on the map? Good, excellent. Well, I don't know if anyone's seen this. It's a study that it was on Washington Post a couple of months ago. Well, here's it. You're laughing at probably some of the places like in South Africa, Australia, Alaska. You'll see a couple of spots. There is in the Boston area, no. But this was a study done, and the correlation was that, let me read that in a second, about 1 in 6, about 16% Americans correctly located Ukraine, living somewhere within its borders. So, here it is. Most thought that Ukraine was located somewhere in Europe or Asia, but the median respondent was about 1,800 miles off, roughly the distance from Chicago to Los Angeles. Locating Ukraine somewhere in an area bordered by Portugal on the west, Sudan on the south, Kazakhstan on the east, and Finland to the north. Here's the catch. The further respondents thought that Ukraine was far from its actual location, the more wrong they were, the more they wanted the U.S. to intervene militarily. The less accurate participants were, the more they wanted the U.S. to use force, and the greater the threat they saw Russia as posing to U.S. interests. Meaning, just because they didn't know, those who knew where Ukraine was, they didn't want the U.S. to intervene in any way, or militarily at least. What does that tell us? What do you think that tells us? What does this correlation tell us? In terms of doing something, in terms of... Pardon? Right. If you know about the region, if you know about something, you're more inclined to be more positive, more realistic, having a more realistic approach. So that's the situation overall. So basic facts: about 45 million. Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe by size. Okay. Usually people in the United States, we have a tendency to compare things to states, countries to the states. Ukraine is the size of Ukraine. Why not learn that? For the sake of consistency, Ukraine is almost the size of Texas. So it's the second largest country in Europe, the first being Russia. Russia happens to be the largest country in Europe and the largest country in Asia. Relatively speaking, quite the population is not homogeneous per se, but it is dominantly Ukrainian. About 78% Russians make up the second largest minority, or the second largest group, ethnic group, about 17%. And then you have a bunch of other minorities included. The Tatar, whose name probably, if we follow the news, came up a lot because of Crimea. Then you have Moldovans, Belarusians. The reason for this, I'll come back to that in a moment, but Ukraine is a byproduct. It used to be part of the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, it didn't matter where you lived. You were a Soviet citizen. You could be Russian living in Kazakhstan, and it didn't make a difference. But it makes a difference now. This is one of the reasons why that population, the spreading of the population, Ukrainians living in Russia or different places, it didn't make a difference. As long as they were in the empire, they were in the country. So, again, putting things in context, this is Ukraine, Russia, obviously. One of the more important things is this is Crimea. We'll come back to that in a moment. The Black Sea, very, very important for Russia. Russia does not have a major outlet to warm waters. Meaning, they do have access to the Baltics, but that sometimes can get frozen in the winter. And in modern military, not so modern military as well, navies made a difference. That's why Russia having a stronghold in the Black Sea, on the Black Sea, was very important. And one of the biggest navy bases that Russia has is actually Crimea. They actually had, it was on loan. The area was on loan from Ukraine after independence. Larger, basically, again, Sevastopol. Does the name Yalta mean anything for anyone?
Yeah.
Which was?
After.
No, it's during, it was there.
During. Yeah.
1944.
It was the conference, Yalta Conference was the most important conference that actually decided the fate of Europe after the Second World War, how it would be when Stalin, Roosevelt, FDR, and Churchill met in Yalta. So it's also historically important region. Simferopol is the capital of the region, and Sevastopol is where the military navy, Russian military base navy is. And as you can see, there's a very narrow strait here that can be connected to Russia. There are ferries that go back and forth to Ukraine. So here's an interesting, and I find it a fascinating thing when one looks at nationalism, national identity. How do you identify yourself vis-a-vis other people? Kiev, capital of Ukraine, is actually the hub of Slavic or Russian, including Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian nationalism. One of the first principalities that ever appeared as a modern, the modern understanding of Russianness appeared in Kiev. And here there was a prince, and it was called, actually that's one of the, how they were recognized, or they were known as Kiev Rus, or the Russians of Kiev. And this was an empire, or this was an area roughly corresponds to mostly the northern part of Ukraine, modern-day Ukraine. But it used to be a principality that expanded, and it became the cultural, political, social, and economic hub for subsequent Russian empires. So there is an emotional attachment. Ethnically, linguistically, Russian and Ukrainian are quite similar. To an extent that, some people, they're mutually comprehensive. It's not that completely any different language. So, and this is very, very important to understand that the conflict is not about, doesn't have any ethnic, religious, or cultural sort of dimension. What is now the land of Ukraine was full of Cossacks. And the Cossacks were nomadic people who were actually the scourge of Russia's enemies. These were the elite. They were fighters on horseback. Even during the Second World War, actually, the German, the Nazi military was afraid of the Cossacks. They were actually settlers. They would settle. The Russian government or the Russian Tsar, the king. Tsar, by the way, comes from the word Caesar. And the Russians always consider themselves to be the inheritors of the Byzantine and the Roman Empire. So there are a lot of elements there of the next empire. So the Cossacks were people who would settle in on the borderlands. Land would be given to them. They can protect it. They would protect it, and at the same time they would expand the empire. This is an interesting painting. Has anyone seen this? Is anyone familiar with this painting?
Yes.
Yeah? Good. Zaporozhian Cossacks. Zaporozhia is a region. Yeah, there we go. This area, the Cossacks, they had a semi-autonomous status. And at some point, the Ottoman Empire, when they fought against the Ottoman Empire, this is a painting painted around the mid-19th century. But the event is supposed to be happening around 17th century. So what they ended up doing is that they wrote a letter. They were responding to the Ottoman Sultan, who after being defeated, he sent a letter to the Cossacks asking them, demanding them to become part of the empire, to subjugate themselves to the empire. But then obviously their response was a letter full of profanity and insults in the letter. Basically, it also shows the pride that they wouldn't submit to any empire, even the Ottoman Empire at the time, one of the biggest. It had been partitioned. One of the stories about when one looks at history of Ukraine, it's also the history of partition. And whenever you have partition, when you're under different empires, you're living, especially in the 19th century, obviously you're going to have linguistic and cultural influences from those empires. So it had been divided between the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Polish part eventually. Poland itself was divided between the Russians, the Prussians, and the Austro-Hungarians. So the elements, or some elements of this still remain in Ukraine. Modern Ukraine, be that in terms of the language and culture and traditions. Eventually, Ukraine was integrated into the larger socio-economic fabric of Russia. There was a revival of nationalism, or a revival of Ukrainian identity in the mid-19th centuries. That was a kind of nationalism. All of Europe was witnessing that. You were part of a citizen, you were a citizen of an empire, as I mentioned earlier, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But then people started thinking of themselves as Czechs, as Slovaks, as Slovenians, and so on. The same thing was happening in Ukraine at the time. So eventually, it became part of, briefly, they were independent during, at the end of the First World War, but then quickly afterward, they were reintegrated into Soviet Union. Under Soviet Union, again, it was the second largest republic, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Ukraine was a very important agricultural and also industrial base. Ukraine was considered, was known as the breadbasket of Europe because of its field, because it could provide food for the rest of Europe. That's how important Ukraine was. But even with that, they had a problem, especially with Stalin's policies of industrialization. These are some concepts. You don't need to know about it, but Polonization and nativization, basically putting all the people in whatever we call Ukrainians, they have to have all of them, or most of them have to live in a country called Ukraine, or Belarusians, they have to live in Belarusian. That's nativization. And as a policy of the Soviet industrialization, the 5-year plans and the plans to modernize the Soviet Union, a lot of people died. Under Stalin alone, Soviet Union lost 40 million people, half of whom were because of during the Second World War. But the other half because they were sent to political reasons, sent to concentration camps, but also bad policies. And nowhere other than Ukraine, this is reflected, no other place than Ukraine. Because of the policies of communizing, if that's even a word, but in terms of putting all the fields, farms, under state control, and basically saying that the state is going to produce wheat and so on. These were bad policies, and they didn't work. So there was famine, what is known as the Holodomor in Ukraine. Over 3 million people died in a period of about 3-4 years. Ukrainians consider this as a direct policy now, especially nowadays, that the Russians did. It was an intentional Stalin Moscow policy. And it was directed against Ukraine. But it wasn't unique to Ukraine. Other parts of the Soviet Union also suffered with the famine and with the oppression. This is the map of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Can you see anything weird here? Or can you tell anything off from the modern map of
Crimea was not part of it.
Crimea is not part of it. ASSR, the Soviet Union, was a masterful bureaucratic system. Just to understand it, it's wonderful. Wonderful, not in a necessarily good way, but wonderful as an interesting way. They had all these divisions. So you had the republics, Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, Russian Federative Socialist Republic, Belarusian Socialist Republic. But within, these were technically autonomous regions. But within each country, you also had autonomous Soviet Socialist Republics. So for instance, Crimea, at the time, was an autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic within the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. So it was taken from Russia and became an autonomous region under Ukraine.
I some dates. What?
Yeah. By the way, I was coming to that. So this is the map of the population decrease in Ukraine because of the famine, showing mostly in the center, most of the urban areas that really suffered in terms of population. 1954 is the date. Since we're here, I'll plot this and then go back. Crimea had had a diverse population: Ukrainians, Russians, and Tatars. Tatars, ethnically, they're closer to Mongols, and they're the remnants of the Mongol hordes, the invasion of Genghis Khan, and so on, that settled there. During the Second World War, Stalin basically exiled them because they cooperated, or he thought, or some of them did. A lot of people did cooperate. They were sick and tired with the Soviet Union, with Stalin. They cooperated with the Germans. So they were all exiled. They were all displaced to Central Asia. And then that changed the dynamic. That changed the nature of what Crimean demographic was about. In 1954, Stalin was no longer the leader of the Soviet Union. Was a guy by the name of Nikita Khrushchev, who was a fascinating person. I mean, at some point, he took off his shoes and started banging it on the table in a UN meeting, in the UN General Assembly. Very hot-headed. But he also oversaw de-Stalinization. His time was also a very important time. It was the thought, it was the de-Stalinization, the Khrushchev thought. A lot of people came back from concentration camps. So as an act of friendship, as an act of favor or whatnot, basically there was a decision in 1954 to move Crimea from being an autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic within Russian Soviet Socialist Republic and put it under the auspices or within the larger context of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. From the Russian perspective, from the Moscow perspective, nothing changed. It was part of the Soviet Empire. From the perspective of these people in Ukraine, as a government-wise, it didn't change as well. Now, instead of dealing directly with Moscow, because they were an autonomous region within Russia, they had to deal with Kiev, the Soviet government in Kiev. So that was the major change. And Ukraine, after independence, Crimea kept its autonomy. That's what happened a couple of months ago in March, when the local parliament met and decided that they wanted to secede. They had the right to secede because they were an autonomous republic. And they wanted to go back to what it was. They said, we want to be back part of Russia as an autonomous republic. Any questions about Crimea? Well, I mean, it's going to be part of the larger discussion possibly later. I mentioned about this, the insurgency army. Actually, up until 1950s, there were partisans, there were guerrilla war, people who were fighting the Soviet Union. You have to understand, of course, with all the Cold War mentality, and this is perhaps one of the fascinating things about what's happening with Russia today. The Cold War mentality and the rhetoric is coming back. Some of the things that you read in newspapers are basically, could easily be written in the 1980s, 1970s about the Soviet Union. You substitute the word Soviet Union with Russia and the leadership, and it's not ideological anymore. Not that it was before, but it's not about ideology. It's about geopolitics. You have different words used, but more or less the same mentality prevails today. And under the Soviet Union, a lot of people were not happy. This is the reason why a lot of people, a lot of nations, a lot of groups looked at German invasion, Nazi invasion, as an opportunity to get rid of the Soviet rule. The problem with the Nazis was that they were so anti-Slavic that they didn't leave room for any of the people there, including the Ukrainians, to cooperate with them. On the one hand, you had Stalin who would kill, just because you're a political dissent. On the other hand, you had the Germans, the Nazis, who would kill you, period, without any reason, because you are Ukrainian. But a lot of people cooperated with it. There were with the Nazi invasion. After the war, they actually remained in the woods, in the forest, kept fighting. It's an insurgency against the Soviet Union. Khrushchev period, the culture revived. There was a lot literature, even, in literature, in identity, in perspective about who we are in the larger context of things as Ukrainians came back. And that gradually increased to the point where there were conflicts or tensions. Because like Russia, one of the things we don't understand is that Russia is a colonial power, was a colonial power, very similar to the French, very similar to the British Empire. It was an empire, it is an empire. It increased, and as such, it uses empires use different techniques, different strategies to control their colonies, the areas that they have under their control. And one of the policies that the Soviet Union had, or Russia in general, was to populate Russia. They would, like the Cossacks, they would bring in people to different constituent republics, like in Ukraine, to decrease the control or the majority of the population, the titular population in that republic. Ukraine was not a bad case. One of the worst cases were in the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. At which point, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in Estonia, Estonians were about 45% of their own country. Russians were about 35, 38%, and other minorities in the other. This was, which eventually became a problem once these countries became independent, because they had now a large population, a large minority, which could potentially destabilize them. Some of you might remember Chernobyl, April 26, 1986. Chernobyl is a nuclear power plant that basically there was a meltdown on the border with very close to Belarus. It was in Ukraine, but actually Belarus suffered more than Ukraine did because of the winds and the winds, how they blow. Basically, they moved in that direction. I just figured out. It doesn't have anything to do with the current conflict, but it's part of history, right? Any questions so far? Anything that raised your that wasn't clear, or yes?
Why do you say that Russia was an empire, but it still is an empire?
Yes.
Now in Czechia, Karelia, Kazakhstan, Ossetia, how many colonies do I need to bring up in order to persuade you that it's still an empire?
The choice of the empire, the choice of the verb was, it's because the context that I was using about the colonial practice as an empire. Russia, in the context that you're using, every country in the world nowadays is an empire, still an empire. Russia is definitely an empire, and the definition of an empire would be a country that actually controls other countries, that actually has within its influence, other countries. The United States is an empire, although there are a lot of people who argue that the United States is not an empire, because the word empire itself has a lot of negative connotations. But whether we like it or not, the United States is an empire, and Russia is an empire. Influences, when we talk about France, the French Francophone influence is an empire.
But I'm not talking about influences, I'm talking about control. For example.
And I was talking about control as well. Controlling Russia does control other countries. That's one of the first things I mentioned.
The United States does not control other countries. France does not control other countries.
Okay.
In fact, it's funny enough that you brought up the Yalta Conference. One of the parts of the conclusions of the Yalta Conference that all the countries in the world, except one, will give up every single colony. That's how decolonization started. That's how France gave up most of the countries in North Africa, Italy gave up Libya, and so forth and so on.
Okay, I can take that. I mean, the discussion, I'd be more than happy to discuss, because I have worked on empires historically, and we can discuss it in a different context or afterwards to discuss why Russia is or is not an empire.
The U.S. has trade flows of over 150 countries.
There is a whole difference between what
Something.
U.S.
There is no one, excuse me. See, this is the problem about understanding and using the terms freely without really defining it and understanding. What does it mean to be an empire?
Well, why don't you open a dictionary that we both agree to definitions and read the definition and you can show me why it's not an empire?
Okay. You're most welcome. Of course, I will do that. Ukraine reappearing in the context of the world power as a world power. Interesting fact: Ukraine, as a Soviet Socialist Republic, was a founding member of the UN. It was a deal between the Soviet Union and the United States, when the UN was being created. Russia, the Soviet Union, figured out that this is a lot of the West or the United States has more sort of allies in the UN. So that's why they made a deal, actually, where Ukraine and Belarus, if I'm not mistaken, were members of the UN, founding members of the UN. So in July 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. He was the young one. He didn't come to power. He was in power. Well, technically, it wasn't in power. He was part of a collective. The Communist Party, the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. At the time, he was the youngest. One in the group of, if I'm not mistaken, 11 Politburo members. He was 65 or 66, and that was the youngest member of the group. Usually there were 80, hovering over 70, 75. He came up with ideas to regenerate, re-energize the Soviet Union, but it went wrong for many reasons, mostly because of the fact that he underestimated, I believe, the level of corruption and the weakness in the Soviet Union, especially under Brezhnev. Leonid Brezhnev was his predecessor. And so he wanted to restructure the economy, open up the country. Freedom, democratizacja, glasnost, perestroika, these were terms that were big. But eventually that led to the collapse of the whole project, the whole Soviet Union. And Ukraine became independent. The first president was Leonid Kravchuk. And there's an interesting transition in the Soviet Union and the former Soviet space today. Former leaders, and in Eastern Europe as well. If one looks at Poland, one looks at Slovakia, Czech Republic, and so on. Those people, those politicians who were in power, generational change is happening now, but at the time, 1980s, late 1980s, early 90s, they were in power as part of the communist group. They were pushed aside. Reformists came to power, nationalists, reformists came to power. But then gradually, the older guard, the ancien regime, the old guard, people came back. Not because there was a conspiracy to come back, but it was practicality. These people who were in power before, they knew how to govern. They understood the reality that changed. So they actually changed their ideology as well. It wasn't just about communism, Marxism, Leninism. It became socialism, social democracy, socialism, and so on. And that's how they came back. Leonid Kravchuk was actually part of that old apparatchik, part of the old structure of the Soviet Communist Party in Ukraine. He became the first president. His successor, Leonid Kuchma, was also the same. No need to remember these names, they're consequential in our discussion.
Just so you know, Mr. says your computer's going to restart. You must be good.
That's all. But that actually, with the development of Ukraine becoming independent, a lot of things have changed. The structure. If one looks at, for instance, the British Empire, the way the British Empire maintained control over its constituent parts was basically to make them interdependent on each other. For instance, India, Egypt had cotton, India had silk, or they didn't have, they had a huge coast. But they were all supposed to import everything from England. That way they made all the different parts dependent on each other. That way it was difficult to secede. The Soviet Union structure, economic structure, was based on that. Where different parts, different constituent republics, you were going to make a car, basically what would end up happening is that the wheels would be manufactured in one republic, the engine in another, the windshield in another, and then they would all be assembled in yet another. This is a bit of an exaggeration, but that's what the economy was. So when these countries became independent, their economies started from sub-zero. They didn't even start from scratch. They started from sub-zero. So economically, they suffered a lot. All of the republics, including Russia. But that's the context. Why is the white? But in 2004, and this is an important thing, and I think Laura mentioned it in the email or on Facebook, I recommend there's an interesting documentary called Democratic Revolutionary Handbook. It might be very difficult to find it online. It's an educational movie. The documentary I showed in my classes. But if anyone's interested, I can share it on Dropbox. I think I have the good copy. You did? Yes, I did.
If you go onto the website, you go under speakers, we find his name. There's a link right there to the video.
So, what was the Orange Revolution? In 1999, it's these color revolutions that the world started talking about. It started in Serbia, actually, when there was an uprising against Milosevic. The whole point about this whole revolution, then it happened in Georgia, the republic, not the state, down in the south, Republic of Georgia, then in Ukraine. Each one has a color revolution reference to it. The reason why it was colorful, A, because it was non-violent. It was relatively in a short period of time, they managed to, civic activists, civil society activists managed to change governments in almost overnight. Dictators who actually were, no one could consider that they would be able to change. Something similar happened in Ukraine in 2004. There were presidential elections to see who's going to succeed Leonid Kuchma. His candidate was Viktor Yanukovych, who won the second round of the election. Ukraine has a presidential system which uses a two-round system. If in the first round, if anyone gets 50% plus one, gets elected. If no one wins 50% plus one, they would have a second round where only the top two candidates would compete. France uses the same system. Russia uses the same system as well. So in the second round, his main challenger was Viktor Yushchenko. The second round, the Central Election Committee announced that Viktor Yanukovych won. And there were blatant examples of voter fraud, and ballot stuffing, and so on and so forth. So the people started demonstrating. They took on the streets in what is now again became popular again, the Maidan in Kiev, the main square in Kiev, which is now being used as a symbol of anti-Yanukovych. By the way, this is the same guy who was actually ousted. In 2004, he was ousted once. I mean, how unlucky would you be to be ousted twice? In like 10 years or so. He didn't, people supported him, Yushchenko, and Yushchenko came to power. The Orange Revolution was that attempt to break the regime. Yanukovych would have been a continuation of Leonid Kuchma, that regime. You know, you can't pick your successor, and then it goes on and on and on. So the Orange Revolution ended that, stopped that from happening. For 5 years, Yushchenko, I should have put in the picture more. Yushchenko became president for 5 years, and then 5 years, after 10 years, no, after 5 years actually, he stepped down, and Yanukovych won again, this time fair and square. So after 5 years of Orange Revolution, changes and so on, he came back. There is a tendency to oversimplify things, pro-Russian, pro-West. Usually that, you know, simplification is always easy. It makes sense. That's how you can see the world much better, no complications. However, you know, in order to understand it, we have to complicate it before we understand it. We have to complicate it, ununderstand it, and then re-understand it again. These were labeled, these two sides were labeled as pro-Russian and pro-Western. In reality, I don't think there is such a thing as pro-Russian, and absolute pro-Western. I mean, these people had their orientation, they had their perspective on issues, and, you know, looking at the changes that are happening around them, they move the country accordingly. It's an ideology perspective that changes. The fascinating thing about the election that happened, the fraudulent election that happened, this is the division. Yushchenko, the pro-Western guy, got most of the votes in this part of Ukraine. And Yanukovych, the pro-Russian guy, got most of the votes in the eastern part and in Crimea. And if you superimpose, it's not a superimposition, but if you bring in another example of how many people, or where do most of the Russians live in Ukraine, minorities live or use Russian as a language, they could be Ukrainian, but using Russian as their first language, it more or less corresponds to the same area of Ukraine, this eastern part of Ukraine, where most of the conflict actually today is happening. So there is a correlation between culture and which candidate you vote for. And so basically, for 5 years, he was in power. Yulia Tymoshenko was also one of the symbols of the revolution, pro-West, but eventually she became a prime minister, and eventually she was actually put in prison because of embezzlement. So it's amazing how fast one sort of changes from, you know, idealizing or talking about ideals, like ideology, to, you know, making money and or being caught. At least she's not been caught.
But that's kind of unfair to say, too, really. I mean,
almost all of them committed.
Of course.
And their trial was pretty harsh. They didn't even.
She had a fallout. You're absolutely right. She had a fallout with her ally.
You should go.
Yep.
But I actually worked for her during that time. And
Were you in charge of her makeovers?
I was supposed to.
I didn't have pictures, but there are pictures. Obviously, you would know before the revolution and after, during. She had a complete makeover. And her bun had like hair, became very popular actually.
Well, when I got involved, she was already doing so. Yeah, I mean, I knew the lawyer very well. Actually, there's actually a lot of readers. I went to Devlin's reader's daughter.
Her husband is a businessman, isn't he?
Yeah.
Yep.
He wasn't really involved in it. I mean, basically, she was mainly put in prison for exceeding her powers. Meaning that she came to a deal with Russia to sell gas at a cheaper price, which was something that was what had to be done in order that Russia at that time would cut off gas to Ukraine. I mean, and basically they took what was actually probably one of the better things she did and held it against her. Yeah, and I mean, basically when they I would talk to the lawyers and they would go through the papers. The papers would be sometimes dated, days in advance. Sometimes they would be like crossword puzzles and things like this. Like it was an absolute complete farce. Like for you to say that she changed suddenly, she used she was dropped a little bit. Like a lot of them, she came to power. When she came to power, she actually became extremely honest and much more so than herself.
Now, the thing about the post-Soviet space is also how much of business and politics interjected. The oligarchs in the former Soviet space, businessmen, and how they made deals, especially under Yeltsin, the former Russian president. One of the things about Russia today under Putin. Pardon?
The Ukrainian oligarchs.
Right. And there's always that thing, as a politician, if you want to survive, as a president of one of the states, you need to make a deal, some kind of deal with the economic oligarchs. And one way or another, everyone is sort of connected to the oligarchs. One of the things that, and we'll come back, I'm going to talk about this, but one of the reasons why Putin is quite popular in Russia, and he is popular, regardless of what you read in the news, he is popular. If I were a Russian living in Russia today, I would vote for Putin. If I were thinking about it from the perspective, putting aside, believing in democracy, civil society, or whatnot, if I didn't believe in those, let's put that aside. But in terms of bringing pride to the country, to my country, in order to basically stopping a lot of oligarchs, at least visibly not being part of the system, increasing the minimum wage and so on. Basically revamping the whole Russia, bringing back the pride, the glory or life, at least the standard of life in the past. That's why I would vote for Putin. So that's one of the other things that would have that needs to be considered.
The Russian oligarchs, Ukrainian oligarchs are different things.
Pardon?
The Russian oligarchs, Ukrainian oligarchs.
Right.
They do not get along.
Of course, obviously. See, it's like during the Second World War, a lot of Italian Americans, for instance, the underground, the mafia, basically cooperated with the United States to fight the fascists in Italy. So you always have that sort of a conflict of interest. Nationalism sometimes overlaps, sometimes parts people or groups from. It's not about. It would be an anti-Marxist argument actually, where Marx argued that proletariat of the world or capitalists of the world cooperate with each other, and all the workers of the world should cooperate against them. But First World War was the major problem, or the Franco-Prussian War was the main thing that actually German businessmen, German capitalists, and German proletariat workers actually worked with each other against French workers and French capitals. A lot thicker than money in this case, or
idea. And another thing that you mentioned was that, and I found interesting because I don't think I've ever brought up during the coverage here, is that the ties between U.S. politicians and especially the oligarchs.
Right. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And I think that has caused a lot of issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, this is not the real reason why people vote for Putin, or that's why he's popular. He's popular only because he exterminated all his opposition.
He's what? Because of what?
Exterminated all his opposition. and there is nothing left. And if you look at the.
I didn't say it was popular, I said if I were living there, that's why I would vote for him,
And
especially in this case.
elections, the second most populous vote, far below himself, is Communist Party. People don't want to go back to communism, so they don't have any other alternative, because he exterminated them.
But he was only able to do that after he gained a certain amount of support from people, which he did, or, Yeltsin was going around Sweden, Norway, and he was drunk.
One thing,
And it's true, they were embarrassed.
one thing about, and this is part of the discussion as well to understand the overall situation of Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Putin in the last 10 years or so, and probably for the next 12 years or so as well, or 10 years until 2024, he actually, the Russian presidency was limited to 2 consecutive terms of 4 years each. No term limit, 2 consecutive. So he stepped down as a prime minister, changed the constitution so that the presidency would be for 6 years, and then he ran again. So he will be president for another 10 years now. One of the things, if one looks at his policies, he has been able to appropriate nationalism or nationalists. He's been able to appropriate also a lot of former communists, mostly because of the fact that reviving symbols in terms of rewriting history. Basically glorifying Stalin as part of the Stalinist era as being part of our history, has to remain there, and so on and so forth. So he actually has he has tried, and I think to some extent he has been successful to become many things with different many people. And that's one of his successes, I think, in terms of remaining in power, although there is a private challenge. By the way, Yulia Tymoshenko, she ran as president in the recent election, Ukrainian elections. Right after she was released from prison, she got about 17 or 18% of the votes versus the guy who got elected, the chocolate king. Well, not because he's made of chocolate, but because of the fact Petro Poroshenko is a businessman. We can't get any more clear interaction between business and politics. He's a millionaire, billionaire, and he has a chocolate factory, so that's why he's known as Chocolate King. So he won the election in recent elections. Couple of issues that will help us also understand the conflict. Some of the issues in Ukraine, population decline. Since independence, Ukrainian population has been under decline. In the last 4 years, it has dropped by about 4 million. And basically, this is a major problem because you need to have younger people to work to fill in the jobs and whatnot to take care of the growing population and the population that is getting older. This is one of the major issues in general. The divide between East and West has always been a problem, even before the recent conflict. The fact that, again, historically, each part of Ukraine has been under different empires, culturally speaking, manifests itself in the form of language, Russian versus Ukrainian. It manifests itself in the form of election. If a candidate is pro-Western, Western part of Ukraine would be voting for that individual. If it's pro-Russian, most of the eastern part of Ukraine will vote for them. Add to this a lot of regionalism. It's a direct result of that. Regionalism in a sense that the different regions, perhaps the way we might associate this in our current reality here is, when people talk, I'm a New Englander versus a California West Coaster or a Southerner and so on. That's the manifestation of regionalism. And regionalism is quite strong in Ukraine as well. People would make fun of, Kievans would make fun of people who live in the north, in Lviv, and so on and so forth. These are elements that actually weaken the sense of national identity, a united country as a single people. Poverty and health. In Ukraine, Russia recovered far faster than Ukraine in terms of its the post-Soviet period in the 1990s. As an example, there were reports, I remember reading at the time, that the average life expectancy for a male Russian in 1992 was 57. That was unthinkable, for a developed country like Russia. 57 years old, if you were born in Russia in 1992, if you were a male, you would be expected to live until the age of 57 because of bad health, bad vodka, you have to admit it. But a lot of the services that the Soviet Union provided didn't exist. But Russia managed to recover from economics, because Russia is also one of the largest, is the largest country in the world, but also one of the richest countries in the world. You know, for 70 years, imagine the Soviet Union existed, maintained as a closed system because of Russia and the wealth that Russia had. They didn't trade, they didn't exchange oil or gas or natural resources with anyone because they had it. And Russia, that's why Russia managed to recover faster than Ukraine. And Ukraine actually has been witnessing a lot of sort of setbacks economically. Bad planning, lack of long-term planning and so on, bad government, that lack of governance in general. So these are some of the issues. Economically speaking, it's always a problem, obviously. Ukraine is heavily dependent on, I'm not going to talk about most of this. Private corruption, we already talked about it. The oligarchs, initial early years where people would get protection money and so on and so forth. That created instability and the mood where people would not want to invest in the country anymore. Ukraine, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, voluntarily gave up all of its nuclear weapons. It was part of an agreement between the Soviet Union and the United States, and that was one of the major problems. The United States, George H.W., basically, when he was a vice president, he visited Ukraine during the time of the Soviet Union. And he actually, in a speech, he asked the people to remain calm and do not force the Soviet Union to disintegrate. Because from a U.S. foreign policy perspective, you would have suddenly 15 different countries to deal with instead of one. You would have at least half a dozen countries which had nuclear weapons. And Ukraine, actually, one of the things, in return of giving up their nuclear weapons, obviously it wasn't because of good gesture and goodwill, they did get some packages in return of financial aid and so on and so forth. But they didn't give up. They do have nuclear power plants, but I think they don't have any nuclear weapons. And of course, after independence, now that Crimea was under Ukrainian control, they needed to sign an important deal, an agreement with Russia, to allow Russia to use Crimea as a naval base.
They have nuclear weapons.
Pardon?
Ukraine has nuclear weapons.
I can't hear you, sir.
Ukraine has nuclear weapons.
They do?
Yeah, of course they do. You don't know that? Are you kidding me?
Could you be more respectful? I appreciate if you could be more respectful, please. I am trying to be respectful, but your tone is a bit insulting. Yeah, even if it's a fact, there's a way to transmit a fact. I've been transmitting a fact without insulting anyone, I'm guessing.
No, I understand what you're saying.
No, I mean, officially,
Officially, they're not supposed to, but yes, they do.
Well, officially, North Korea doesn't have nuclear weapons.
Yes, you say officially.
Officially, Ukraine has nuclear weapons because when the agreement was signed between Russia, United States, and EU and Ukraine, they promised to defend Ukraine in exchange for giving up nuclear weapons. But nuclear weapons was never dismantled, was never picked up.
Well, I know for a fact that my former father-in-law used to go to Ukraine to do the dismantling of the weapons. There were actually a United States company that were hired to do that. That's the reason why I'm saying, and I know the agreements. I've seen the agreement, the first-hand agreement that was signed to get rid of it. Now, if I may continue, now my area of specialization is not nuclear proliferation. So yes, that's why I don't know for sure that if Ukraine has nuclear weapons or not. Moving on.
A few weeks ago, I'm sorry, Timoshenko was caught, and this was another thing that worked against her. Recently, she was caught on tape saying that she was going to blow up.
Yeah, actually, that was before the election, wasn't it? It was used actually I mean, she blamed it as people using it against her campaign.
Right.
Now, the whole mess, when did this whole mess start? I mean, usually when we talk about any conflict, it doesn't start overnight. There are things that develop, and then there would be a powder cake that would require that sort of spark to start. The thing that started the spark, or the overall conflict has been going on. This is what I've been talking about. The Orange Revolution, the corruption, economic conditions, and so on, dependence on Russia, economically speaking, gas and energy-wise. These were basically the brewing. This was the brewing part. What sparked it was actually a deal that the president at the time who is not the president anymore, made with Russia to join something called the Eurasian Economic Union. Russia, using soft power, and this is, down below I will talk about it, but Russia, there's a concept called soft power in politics, which basically means the government or a country forcing another country to do something by using economic incentives. The US is very big on this, has been able to provide a lot of assistance and force countries to do that. And Russia does the same thing. So the Eurasian Economic Union was the brainchild of Putin, who basically wanted to create an economic customs union within the former Soviet states, within the former Soviet space, in what is known as also the Commonwealth of Independent States. Very loose federation of what the Soviet Union was. And this came at a time when Ukraine was actually signing or negotiating with the European Union to get into partnership, a larger neighborhood. It was known as a larger neighborhood policy, where the European Union was signing deals with former Soviet republics and a lot of non-member states to become part of the economic cooperation. So, in the minds of a lot of people, this would have been the European Economic Union or European integration, or signing the deal with the European Union, would have provided more opportunities for them. But for some reason, the government decided that no, we're going to turn our backs, and instead, with it almost in a fortnight, they actually signed a deal with the Russians. The same thing happened, by the way, with Kazakhstan and Armenia. These two countries also actually joined in this union almost overnight. Armenia had the same issue as Ukraine. They actually were about to sign an economic partnership with the European Union. But within 3 weeks, they discarded it and they signed this agreement with Russia. This precipitated the demonstrations. Just like in 2004, the false elections or the falsified elections precipitated the demonstrations in Kiev, in Ukraine. The other thing to understand, and a lot of people don't in the United States, is that, has anyone heard of the Monroe Doctrine?
Yes.
It's basically an idea in the early 19th century that no country in the Western Hemisphere or outside of the Western Hemisphere can intervene in the Western Hemisphere, be that North or South America or the Caribbean. In other words, it's a U.S. way of saying, no one can colonize, no one can influence these countries other than us. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a direct result of this. The Cuban Missile Crisis was used, the Monroe Doctrine, or utilized the Monroe Doctrine, saying that the Soviet Union is putting a foothold in their region. That's why we need to stop it. That's why they embargo and so on and so forth. Fine, the United States is an empire. In that context, it needs to protect its interests. So they have the Monroe Doctrine. The Russians have a similar, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they had a similar doctrine. Primakov, it's known as the Primakov Doctrine, named after a former prime minister. But they use the term the near abroad. It's a very interesting approach, where they would actually, looking at the former Soviet Union, the countries of the former Soviet Union, they said, these are countries abroad now. They're not part of Russia, but they're the near abroad versus the far abroad. And this is actually part of the doctrine mentioning that, this is an area of interest, geographic area of interest. It's our sphere of influence, and we wouldn't tolerate any outside special American intervention in this. If we were having this if this initiative was happening in 2008, almost 6 years ago, one of the hottest topics at the time was the Georgian-Russian War. And the Georgian-Russian War was a manifestation, to a large extent, to the Primakov Doctrine or the near abroad concept. Because Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, was actually extending a lot of cooperation with the United States. Membership in NATO, they wanted to get to NATO, they antagonized Russia, and eventually it came to conflict. And while the United States, it's a weird thing, I think to some extent, policymakers in the United States do acknowledge that these are areas of Russia's influence. They do acknowledge that these are areas that Russia has vital interests. And, why wouldn't Russia have vital interests in areas that the United States have it and Russia would not? But then they do not communicate this clearly to the leaders of those countries. One of the things about the Georgian-Russian War was the Georgian president thought that the West was going to come to his rescue if he fought the Russians. But the West knew it better, especially Europe. And in this case, it would be naive to think about the West as a single entity. It's not the Cold War mentality. This is another thing. A lot of people look at this as a West versus Russia, West versus the United States. The policy is actually one of the more successful diplomats in this process in terms of bringing Russia and Ukraine together was Germany, is Germany, Europe mostly, especially Angela Merkel, the German Prime Minister. Yes, almost done. So that is the reason why Russia would not tolerate any kind of a secession, or as it would perceive, Moscow would perceive it as separation or secession from its satellite or state or its sphere of influence. Now, this.
I mean, to be fair, I also spent a lot of time in Georgia. I worked with soccer too.
Yep. I lived in Georgia for 2 years, and it was before and after the revolution. And let's talk about it afterwards.
I mean, I know it very well, but I mean, the thing is that the U.S. did get some a lot of.
Well, there was the train and equip program, which were basically Georgian forces, military trained by NATO, and they were under the auspices. They served in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and eventually. I mean, the whole thing precipitated with the, again, region, the South Ossetia.
Then why would you say that Georgia chose to go to war with Russia? I mean,
well, this is, again, there's too many, I'm an academic. I do not take sides. I cannot claim to be objective. There is no such thing as objectivity. I have to admit that. I could be as less subjective as possible. However, unlike, I think, I follow news and I've talked with diplomats, American diplomats as well, and Georgian ministry, people now, especially after Saakashvili is gone. It was the Georgian side that provoked Russia. I mean, there are.
What did they do to provoke Russia?
Well, actually, the interference or allowing people or paramilitary groups to cross into Khimbali, into South Ossetia. But again, let's focus on this. I would like to engage you in this. I would like to talk about, I would like to see your perspective as well on this. But let's focus on this. Sure. The current area of conflict in eastern Ukraine, again highlighted. The BBC, by the way, does a great job in terms of the maps and the factual analysis of BBC News. This is mostly the area where you would see most of the conflict going on in the eastern provinces, as well as the border with Russia. A couple of things here as concluding thoughts. One of the biggest issues in this whole conflict, overall in this whole relation, is the issue of natural gas. Russia has the largest proven amount of natural gas. The different places give different numbers. They say Iran versus Russia, but I think Russia is the one that has the largest natural gas reserves in the world. Not only that, pipelines going from what is now Russia, or what was now the Soviet Union, into Europe are very important. These are oil pipelines. The blue ones are oil pipelines, and the red ones are gas pipelines. For just reference, 36% of Germany's natural gas imports come from Russia. 27% of Italy's comes from Russia. 15% in France. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, 100%. Ukraine, about 65% of Ukrainians' natural gas usage or import comes from Russia. When I was talking about soft power, this is the soft power that Russia has. And the way they use it, the way they have used it recently, just for comparison, in the last 10 years, the price of 1,000 cubic meters of natural gas that Russia sold to Ukraine multiplied exponentially. At the beginning of in 2008, it was $235 per 1,000 cubic meters. That's how you measure cubic as a volume. At the end of last year, it was about $300, well below the price, the average gas price in the world market. It was subsidized. Now, they stopped it to start with. They're not exporting gas to Ukraine as a punishment because they're saying Ukraine owes Russia $5 billion, which they do, and they need to plan a payment. Otherwise, they're going to stop it, and they did stop it. And the latest agreement signed in April was that if Ukraine decides to buy Russian gas, it's going to be $485 per 1,000 cubic meters. That's $85 above the price, average price. Obviously, different places will be different. It's not, there is no one price. It depends where it's coming from, how long will it be. European Union basically offered to sell Russia Ukraine gas, whereas Ukraine, most of the pipelines, by the way, to Europe go through Ukraine. So it's not only Ukraine that is consuming it, but also their transit. That's the importance as well. This is why this whole thing, conflict here, it's detrimental in terms of the energy market and for Europeans as well. I love this picture. Again, Angela Merkel, I think she's one of the more successful negotiators and diplomats in the last 10 years or so when it comes to a lot of conflicts. She has been very powerful and influential in that. This is the latest meeting at the G8 meeting, the G7 and a half, G8, whatever you want to call it nowadays. I'm getting confused. Again, consistency. There is no consistency. Things are changing so fast that we can't keep up. But on the sidelines, she actually tried to negotiate with to bring the two parties together, the Ukrainian and the Russian president. There is a ceasefire now agreement, or a unilateral ceasefire agreement from the Ukrainian side, and Putin has announced that he's going to respect, or he's optimistic about it. However, the problem of this whole conflict in the western part, eastern part of Ukraine, is that it took a military confrontation, it took a military form, because of people living there. They actually, after the ouster of the president of Ukraine, they felt that they were threatened. This was the ouster of the former president of Ukraine was a direct sort of hit towards Russia's Moscow's policies of bringing Ukraine into the economic customs union or Eurasian customs union and so on. As a result, and this is where the question is, Russia has been denying it, a lot of people in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, paramilitary groups, who claim that they are just people, Russians living in that part. They're the ones who are taking things into their own hands to protect their lives, arguing that what's happening in Ukraine or in Kiev, these are fascists, these are, I mean, they're that sort of paranoia degree level of mistrust towards them. However, and the problem is that both in the eastern part of Ukraine and also in Crimea, Ukrainian TV is not broken, they jam it. It's being jammed. And I talked with this just about two weeks ago. I was interviewing with two colleagues in Ukraine who actually had gone to Crimea. And most of the news that they were getting was from some Russian TV stations or some Russian stations, which were actually creating some kind of a hysteric sort of a very bad. Actually, there was one report that NATO had actually landed forces in Kiev. There were reports about that.
So who's fighting who, where, and why?
Who's fighting who, where, and why?
Because you see on TV.
Was there any other W's? When?
Recently.
Technically, and in reality, well, technically speaking, it's Russian citizens in eastern Ukraine who are afraid of the nationalists. Technically speaking, that's the official version. Okay? Russian. Official Ukrainian, official Russian version.
Oh, okay.
Now, the Ukraine, so the Russian citizens who make up about 17–18% of the population, most of them live there. They're the ones who took up arms, paramilitary groups, militias fighting the local government, the central government. Okay.
The Russians
in Ukraine, Ukrainian citizens of Russian ethnicity. Okay? Now, there were reports, and there were a lot of, several EU officials, military observers were captured when they went there to the region to observe. They were captured, and according to them, they were let go afterwards. But there are unconfirmed, there is no way to confirm this, but there are only factual. May I continue, please? I didn't finish what I was saying. They were reports that there is no official, you could not confirm it, but military observers have looked at the weapons that are being used by the paramilitaries, the insignia or the hidden insignia on their uniforms, and so on.
You say paramilitary, you mean the Russian
And-
speaking Ukrainian?
Yes, so far we're talking about this. And they have come to the conclusion that these cannot be just militias. These are not paramilitary groups. The way they function, their tactics, their strategies, their weapons, the way they would hold their weapons, and all of that shows that these are actually official troops. I mean, these are trained military groups. Now, again, there is no actual fact, otherwise it would have blown in their face. But again, the thing is that these are Russian special services, not secret, but special services, camouflage. They would change their clothing, they would change their uniform, and they would actually, that's one of the other reasons why they put, a lot of these people are putting ski nets on their faces, not to be recognized. But sometimes there was actually an interesting report about the posing, how you stand holding the gun. It's a whole art to it.
And they're fighting.
They're actually supporting the Russian population of Ukraine. They're fighting against the Ukrainian military, which is trying to reassert its control in Eastern.
So the Ukrainians are killing them?
Pardon?
The ethnic Ukrainians are killing the Russian?
Well, see, to formulate the question in that way, I think there's actually the Ukrainian army, where there are also Russians, not a lot, but there are Russians serving in the Ukrainian army, ethnic Russians. And it's basically a conflict of the government, Ukrainian government. Now, we could disagree whether or not this is the officially recognized legitimate government or not, put aside. The Ukrainian government, central authority, is trying to assert its influence and its control over its territory. Because most of the people here, in some places, especially in Donetsk, or in Donetsk region, the south here, they actually claim that we are an independent republic. And we want to join Russia, just like Crimea did. So in reality, the conflict is it's a civil war conflict, at least technically, because Russia officially did not intervene. The moment there is a proof that Russia is present in eastern Ukraine, that is intervention, that is war, that is crossing the border.
So those sections want to succeed.
At least some of the groups there who are actually wanting to create an environment or create autonomous republics and then eventually join Russia. I will give Laura first, then you two, because she had her hand first.
Yeah, I just want to say, just thank you everyone for being engaged in this.
I see.
I'm not finishing.
Yeah,
Okay. So I just want to thank everyone for engaging in this. Obviously, you can tell there are a lot of different perspectives, right? And there's no truth, there's no one answer. So I appreciate everyone just being involved. Obviously, you have some personal experience with this, and you do as well. So that's great. Thanks very much for that. And definitely the intentions for people who have no idea what's going on, kind of just to get a basic background understanding of what is happening. So I think something that would be at least helpful for me is to get a sense of, so what it is that there are, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there are different perspectives of what's actually going on, right? There's the Russia one thing, Ukraine is saying one thing, maybe Europe is saying one thing, the US. I mean, that is for me would be very helpful to get a sense of who's saying what. There's no truth that we can distill, but at least who's saying what.
Well, Ukrainian perspective is that Russia is trying to destabilize Ukraine, fragment it, and then absorb the parts, Russian parts. Now, be that physically, by taking the land and annexing it and whatnot, I mean, that's a bit of an overstatement, paranoia, because I don't think that could ever happen in the context of officially annexing the country. I mean, you can militarily, no one's going to be able to do it. But that's what Ukraine is saying. It's saying that Russia is instigating or is encouraging people to take arms and to fight the Ukrainian government. And eventually, with the election of the new president just 2 days ago, as I said, he announced a unilateral ceasefire. He said, we are not going to attack these people anymore. We are not going to attack the rebels in these towns anymore. Russian perspective is that there is an approach that Ukraine went into change, a government change, a regime change. A regime, to say the least, is Western-oriented, to say the least. That's almost borderline, you would say, nationalist. They would also refer to them as nationalists. They would refer to them as fascists, and so on and so forth. But there's a regime change. And under those circumstances, ethnic minorities non-Ukrainians living in Ukraine are in danger. Now, I mentioned earlier, 17% of Ukraine are Russian. So that's the only major other minority. So they're saying that ethnic Russians are in danger to be, their lives are in danger. And something needs to be done about it. They're not saying that we're going to do it. They're not saying that, but they are saying that we support the people, any kind of negotiation that could happen. The Western perspective in all this, mostly American perspective, would be very Cold War mentality. Saying that, but not taking rhetoric-wise, in terms of, calling, even considering in some cases, Putin to be equating him to Hitler and so on and so forth. This is Munich happening all over again. Munich was when Austria was signed off to Nazi Germany and so on and so forth. Europe has more of a conciliatory approach, as manifested in the form of Angela Merkel, trying to negotiate. For many reasons. Europe is closer. They have dealt with Russians more and closely in the last, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Europe depends on Russian gas and oil. It's not just about, screw you and, we're not going to deal with you. They can't do it. 1/3 of Germany's gas comes from Russia. So Germany's approach has been not make statements, or Europe's, mostly European Union, not to make grandiose statements, not to take sides per se, but say, why don't you guys come and talk? And that's actually one of the major things about, and I think to some extent, that's the direction at this point that we're going. The problem is, when it comes to politics, you can make long-term projections based on institutions. You know how an institution functions. And you can predict how people would react. The problem with Russia is that you need to know how Putin thinks, not an institution, how an institution would react to this. But as of now, how things are developing, how things are working, the trajectory is that European mediation, possibly, and also the unilateral ceasefire announcement by Ukraine, might lead to things to sort of calm down. But I am not excluding the fact that these regions would end up being outside of direct Ukrainian control. It would be not unrecognized republic per se, but sort of like Afghanistan, where outside of Kabul you have everyone catch kind of a situation. But there are a lot of developments that are happening at the same time, and it's absolutely impossible to project and predict as to what's going to happen, because things change, are changing literally, on a daily basis. It used to be on an hourly basis. Things are better, I guess now. It's only on an hourly basis. Do you mind if I take this question first? Yeah, ask it.
The goods that are produced in these two regions, are they shipped into Russia or are they shipped into the rest of Ukraine? Where are the economic ties of these regions?
The economic ties, actually, when it comes to transportation, let's start with that transportation. They're more attached to, these sides are more roads and railways and so on, they're closer to Russia than they are to Kiev. That's historically, that's the case. I'm not sure about the goods that are coming out of there. It's mostly, the northern part of Ukraine, the northwestern part is mostly industrial. And it's the eastern part, also southern, some of the south is more agricultural. I'm not sure if agriculturally speaking, Ukrainian agricultural export, Russia buys them or not. I don't think they do. Again, just an educated guess, Russia has its own agricultural base, they don't need it. So I don't think there is an economic connection per se in that sense, but when it comes to one by one, please.
Ukrainian economies depending on Russia
Right.
buying these things.
Mm-hmm.
It's the largest.
Yeah.
So there's huge.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
Right.
another reason that another tension is
Mm-hmm.
that Russia keeps threatening to Mark.
That's the soft power concept, and yes, regardless of. He said Ukraine's economy depends on Russia anyway. Russia controls most of the economy. more or less, the goods and services usually go come or import and export. The volume of import and export is mostly with Russia. It's, yeah. Just 1 second. Pardon, that was a comment, not a question.
I was going to say, like, you know, I was going to try to, in my head perspective, explain how, you know, I see the relationships and what helps me kind of clarify. And, you know, first of all, yeah, sorry, Yanukovych, you know, he was a truck driver from Donetsk. He Putin's puppet and came to power when Putin said he did.
This is Yanukovych,
Right.
the president that is
great. Yeah, the guy who was just out. Ukraine is extremely important to Russia for many reasons. He was talking about, you know, because of the Black Sea, and they, you know, the Russian Black Sea fleet was basically Ukraine. Because of the fact that the Russian oil, gas exports and oil exports going to Europe, a lot of them, you know, to this point, I think they're changing now, through Ukraine. You know, there's many reasons, you know, but so, you know, it's not plausible for Putin to think that he can't control Ukraine. It's very dangerous in terms of, you know, how it would affect the Russian economy, how it could affect, you know, the perception of the Russian military power, with people knowing that they don't have access to open seas without you. So basically, you know, when this happened, and Yanukovych is talking about was ousted, he, the first instinct was to go in and take Crimea, the military, which was being leased to Russia. Yanukovych had broken the Ukrainian constitution and leased it to Russia for, 60-something years.
You know, one of the things I was thinking, overall in this context, one of the things I was thinking that could happen, but it didn't. Luckily, that also shows how Russia didn't want to escalate, is that once Crimea would declare its independence, Yanukovych would go back into Crimea and say, you know, this is legitimate. I mean, that could have been that would have been the extreme case that Russia might have taken to basically, you know, challenge Ukraine.
But then what Russia needs is you know, a land crossing where it can get and supply Crimea, which is the transcender, which is where, you know, a lot of these Russian industrial cities are. And not to mention the fact that, you know, like in Putin's area is also the Donbass, which is Ukraine's biggest producer of coal, and, you know, it accounts for about a third of its economy, period. And so, you know, if Russia, you know, doesn't feel comfortable in owning, you know, or maintaining Crimea without being able to, you know, have a comfortable supply chain to it. So that's why, you know, it's pretty well known that they launched these, you know, paramilitary attacks because the U.S. was, you know, putting sanctions on the Uyghurs, putting sanctions, and it was a way for Putin to say, hey, I'm not involved in that, prove it, you know, so, you know, it was,
by the way, the day after, just in parentheses, the day after Crimea had a referendum for its independence, the next day, or 2 days later, I think Medvedev, who was the current prime minister of Russia, announced a package deal of a couple billion rubles and investment, actually even thinking about building a bridge between this, which is not viable. I talked to a couple of people, structurally, engineering-wise, it's impossible to build a bridge like that for various reasons, but, you know, the political capital that would come out of it. So it's like, basically, I'm not taking something, but I'm enticing someone to come to me. That's Russia's role. Basically, I'm not reaching in and taking things, but I'm, you know, if you want to come to me here, I have an incentive for you.
I don't think that that's true. I think Russia feels like
Pardon?
I think Russia feels like and the Russian population at this point feels the same, that they feel like they have the right to it. They feel like that's.
Well, obviously, the whole sense of independence, and again, you have to remember the whole context that as a Russian living in the Soviet Union, you were in a minority in any of the republics, and then suddenly out of nowhere, you know, this empire doesn't exist, and basically from that perspective on, you're a minority. You suddenly become a minority. I mean, most of these countries introduced language laws that really alienated. In the Baltic countries, there was even a citizenship law about your language. If you don't speak this language, you're not, you know, if you don't speak the language, you're not going to be getting citizenship. Kazakhstan, Ukraine don't have those languages. But still, as a minority, you have the fear, existential fear, which, again, you're absolutely right. There is an existential fear as a minority. And then I'll give you the
Shelf mentioned But there.
Pardon?
Went there.
Yeah.
Clearly level of course. How did it go from, it seems like people kind of voting sort of pro-Russia, sort of pro-West, versus kicking out the Chocolate King guy and Crimea, leaving Ukraine? Like,
How did it go from voting to different candidates?
two victors they're voting on different lines. Then in 2000, I think this year, the Chocolate King gets booted out by them like storming the castle. And then Crimea.
Yeah.
See, how did it go from peaceful democratic elections or relatively democratic elections to more?
But see, that's the thing. These were brewing. They were already brewing. The country was different. I mean, even after the Orange Revolution, after 2004, when everything is on track, we're becoming a democracy. The economy is not performing well. You still have corruption. You still have favoritism. You still have a country whose economic base is dependent on another country solely, on Russia, energy, and so on and so forth. And you have people leaving the country. A lot of people migrating, and so on. So it wasn't just happened suddenly. The thing is that, see, that's the problem. No one in the West, in the United States, no one takes the time to talk about the media, and it's suddenly, there's a revolution, and then suddenly, seceding and Russia intervening and so on. This has been an ongoing process. And as it's proven by the fact that in the 2003 elections, you had the country divided. How do you explain this electoral result? One candidate, one side, half of the country voting, split in the middle, literally. Voting for one candidate or the other, because one candidate is pro-Russian, the other one is pro-Western. Again, I give this at face value. I'd like to take this at face value. And eventually, what precipitated is a lot of conflict. I do not exclude that one has to look into these things in the larger context. That Ukraine is becoming an example, or Russia is trying to make, again, hypothetically speaking, Russia is trying to make Ukraine as an example so that other countries of the former Soviet Union will not do a similar thing. Do not become pro-Western. You have, your orientation should be towards us, looking in. You need to look towards Moscow, not towards Brussels, not towards DC. So all of these together combined actually made this a reality happen. Suddenly, you have conflict, you have Crimea seceding, declared. I mean, technically they had the right to secede because they're an autonomous region. And as an autonomous region, that's why I'm also saying that when it comes to understanding administrative divisions in the former Soviet Union, or understanding them now, you need to really understand how things operate, or the levels of autonomy you had in the Soviet Union. And the regions in the East, they don't have the same autonomy as Crimea does. Crimea is technically recognized as an autonomous region within Ukraine. Those regions are districts within Ukraine. No, they do not have, they're like districts, but without the level of self-autonomy.
Quebec?
Can they go back?
No, Quebec.
Oh, Quebec. No, Quebec is more autonomous. You mean Crimea?
Yeah.
Yeah, Crimea definitely would be more like Quebec. Yeah. Let me just take your question.
I'm going to jump in real quick. So it's 7:30 now, so I acknowledge that some of you may have to go, and I acknowledge that some of you may want to stay and continue the conversation. So if you have to go, thank you so much for being here. I want to give a quick applause to Asbed. Obviously, there's so much, right? There's just so much.
And I tried to talk fast.
Yeah, there's so much to do. So if you do have to go, I totally respect that. If you could please fill out a survey, it would be very helpful for us in doing this in the future, especially if you have different ideas for future Civic Series sessions. And but we'll keep on going.
Yeah. Do you mind? Are you going? Are you leaving?
No.
Okay.
So a couple of things.
Yes.
First of all, you could use uniforms of people on top and beneath and entrance way. It's much more difficult to do a uniform on a king.
Yeah.
Generally, the king comes from armies.
Yep.
And that kings in Ukraine fighting Ukrainian armies. I don't think they came from Italy. I don't think they came from Germany. They had to come from somewhere.
Yep.
If that's not true, then I don't know.
Russia's made a mistake.
I did not interrupt you.
Sorry.
Go on.
Second of all, yesterday, they found an official, I don't know how to say it in English. The
Official Bechat?
seal, yes, of Russian gold bank, the government bank, of the money that they paid to their armies that fight in there. And third, when a bus full of military people come to the city, and not only they don't know where Main Street is, but they assume that the Opera House is City Hall. Chances are they're probably not local, and that's probably a good proof. And if that's not true, then the license plate of the bus that they came in is a definite proof that it's not the plane.
That would be, I mean, in legal terms, I agree with all you said, but in legal terms, that would be circumstantial.
So,
You do not, again, I completely agree. I'm not saying all of it is right. Everyone knows that Russia is involved. Everyone knows.
that you're talking about Ukraine, and yet, when you were asked about your opinion on what is that opinion, what's the official line, you chose to present a Russian official line.
I presented all the official lines.
Official line on what's going on.
I presented all the sides. Perhaps you were not following, but Laura asked me the question, and I presented 4 different distinct
That was
perspectives.
afterwards, the very first time when you were asked right there by the gentleman who just left. What's the official? You asked whose, and then I was following very closely. Then we presented the Russian government side and not the Ukrainian.
So
Okay.
I totally understand where you're coming from, and maybe you can talk about it afterwards if you're open to doing that. And that's actually why I stepped in, because I wanted to make sure that that perspective was taken care of. So I think it's clear, hopefully it's clear people with different perspectives are, and that there is a debate over what the official version is. So that is certainly clear, but I'm hoping that we can at least hear from some people who maybe have
I'll
less of
accept
an
that.
understanding of what's going on, maybe don't have a personal connection, really want to understand more of the basics. So I'm hoping we can move the conversation in that direction.
Yep, let Alexander, and then I'll give the floor.
So there was a strange situation when Russia took Crimea, and on the other side, they do a lot of negotiations about gas price, about import export. But for me, it's weird. So on the one hand, one country takes a big piece of your country, and on the other hand, you negotiate about dimes and penny, and for me, it makes
It's a
no
very good
sense.
observation. Very good observation.
So, and there are a lot of flights, there are a lot of trains, communications, exchanging on any level, and still, one country took a piece of another country, and like nothing can happen.
The business of politics is business. It's meaning, what you do politics, sometimes there are a lot of elements of business and economy and so on and so forth. This is perhaps as oxymoronic as it sounds, as contradictory as it sounds. This is,
It's the most contradictory thing.
No, absolutely. And this can be argued by the same argument. I can turn it around and say that if these two countries have a conflict, but they have an economic gain from cooperating with each other, then that should be a reason for them to resolve their conflict.
Yeah.
Right? But it's not logical. There is no logic in
First
this.
World War, Germany, ex-France, and they still need to
Right.
negotiate about
No, absolutely. Sometimes it's irrational, but I think there are elements there. There are different elements here when one comes to issue of the conflict. We'll talk about the conflict, but when it comes to the economic aspect of it, because it's not just Ukraine that is, I think, going to suffer or benefit from any kind of an economic deal, especially about gas.
Yeah.
Potentially, again, this is where, WikiLeaks, you want to have WikiLeaks constantly happening so that you know what the diplomats and whatnot are thinking and talking about. But it is quite possible, as an interpretation of other diplomatic activities and so on, that while Europe, especially Europe, is actually supporting Ukraine and to keep its territory and, stand up against Russia, but at the same time, they're also saying that we're not going to support you if you turn your back on these economic issues, on the gas and whatnot issues. So in that sense, Ukraine is caught between.
But besides gas, at the same time, Russia, buys a lot of, I don't know, sunflower oil from Ukraine.
Right, right.
And they still have a lot of business. It's the same like the division in Georgia. So
Right.
Russia owns Georgia. At the same time, Georgia negotiates about the price of electricity and gas. So
Right.
all these trades and money transactions didn't stop not for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a new kind of world when
It is a new world.
on one street there is a money, on the other street there
People
is
signing agreements and negotiating. Yeah.
negotiating.
I
So
mean, that's, I think, the nature of modern politics. I mean, because you have business overtaking.
the same president, in Georgia,
Yeah.
he was making deals with gas and
Mhm.
electricity, and
Although the new president in Georgia is considered to be pro-Russian.
even Saakashvili,
Right, of course.
like at that very moment, they were negotiating about gas prices.
Uh-huh.
Like 1 hour he's talking about 2 people. The second hour he negotiates about don't turn off the electric power.
Well, see, electricity in Georgia, for instance, is controlled by a Russian company. It used to be controlled by an American company during Shevardnadze. They couldn't handle it,
Yeah.
and they sold it. There's a wonderful documentary about this called Power Trip. It
Yeah.
talks about that,
Even,
about Power Trip. Yeah.
what happened? The electricity came from Abkhazia.
Mhm.
They were in Korea or whatever, some big electric power, and the Georgia
Russians
thought,
control
do whatever, war is war, but there is, pipelines there and there, don't touch it.
It's like a kid fighting with their parent, but then, and afterwards saying, but this shouldn't have any impact on my allowance.
Yeah.
That's reality, it's not a kid, it's a parent anymore. That analogy, just to make sure that there's I think both sides understand. Economically, the world is so interdependent today that they understand no matter, even if you go to war, you're still going to do business with each other. Armenia and Azerbaijan, with the war going on between them, in Sadaklo, in Georgia, southern part of Georgia, they make business there. They've always, actually, during war, Armenia used to buy Azerbaijani oil when they were fighting the Azerbaijanis.
Yeah.
Because there are people who don't give a damn about their war. They don't give a damn about blood. They don't give a damn about nationalism and whatnot, history and so on. What do they want to do business? That is the nature of business. Yes.
Yeah, so forgive me if I didn't quite get this before, but.
I hope not.
Were you saying that one of the things that sparked the sort of paramilitary uprising was Ukraine moving towards signing the economic deal with Europe?
Not the conflict. Ukraine was about to sign an economic agreement with the European Union.
Right.
And then Russia forced Ukraine, the president, to sign an economic deal with Eurasia.
Got it.
People started demonstrating. And then Crimea decided to secede, and they had the right, they had the legal framework to do so.
Yeah.
Eastern part didn't have that legal framework. That's why what they did is they actually, you see the military conflict as a substitute for the legal framework. Perhaps that is a very good way. This is also a good way for me to frame it, I think, that Crimea had a legal framework. Whether or not it was used rightly or wrongly or whatnot, they had a framework to work with. Eastern provinces that don't have that legal framework. They don't have autonomy. They cannot cite the Constitution and so on and do it. That's why they resorted to, conflict, into armed conflict, in which eventually, Russia either instigated or took part. Again, I do not know for a fact. That's why otherwise if I say Russia intervening, it's a belief. And I don't want to come across as someone, I do believe that it's intervening. But in this context, I'm not running for anything. I don't care. It's not about politics, so I don't care what people would think. Let me ask the lady first.
Can I ask two questions?
Okay.
Okay. So one is, how much of this do you think is Russia's actions are tactical and economic versus kind of gestural and an FU to the West?
Versus
just to provoke the West and have to,
Why does it have to be an either or? Can it be both?
Just your opinion, how much of it do you think?
I think this is where understanding Russia today is very, very important. Understanding Putin again is very important. When you look at Russian politics, Soviet politics, Russian politics, imperial Russian politics as well, there's always thinking long term. It's not tactical, it's always strategic. You think long term. Strategy is a long term. Tactic is on the ground. I think.
Can you give an example from imperial policy?
The imperial policies, Napoleon's invasion of Russia. You know, Russians didn't basically go in conflict. They withdrew, and then eventually, you know, they let the weather and whatnot take over. I mean, this is a military policy. But also in terms of in terms of expanding the country, expanding the realm of Russia, you know, it requires a long-term plan to have settlements, the Cossacks in Central Asia, in various parts of Europe. So that would be long-term.
And can you talk about this conflict and what?
In terms of this conflict as well, I think with Putin, when he came to power, he did have that long-term. I mean, he's someone, I believe he's very smart. I believe he's very smart. He's not a dumb person. So I think his background in intelligence also makes him someone who would think long-term and plan long-term. I don't think, again, I don't have any proof, but I'm more inclined that in his mind, about maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, he didn't have an overall idea as to the effect of, he's a chess player, let's put it this way. Even making the first move, he would think 7, 8 moves ahead. Hypothetically, but still think. I wouldn't put past him that he would have thought about such a scenario, possibly in Ukraine, if Ukraine goes in a certain direction. I'm not talking about details. It's not just that he's a prophet, you can see, but I think to a large extent, he's also someone who's able to take advantage of things. One basic example, Syria. Okay, the chemical weapons of Syria. There was a huge thing about the chemical weapons of Syria, if you remember. Then, you know, the U.S. saying that you either give up your, you know, we're going to go in because Syria has chemical weapons. Kerry basically made a statement that, you know, we're not going to use the military option if, you know, we can get rid of the chemical weapons of Syria. Almost instantly, Lavrov, the foreign minister, made a statement that we then suggest that we go and Syria signs an agreement to get rid of its chemical weapons. I think this shows a level of preparedness. This shows a level of thinking ahead. It might have been a close circle. It might have come from Putin, but you know, Lavrov is not a dumb man as well. But I think there is that strategic long-term thinking. But also, there is that antagonism towards the West. What a lot of people do not understand that Russia is a powerful country. You cannot just dismiss Russia just because, you know, they're doing this or they're doing that, or we don't understand them, and so on and so forth. Russia is the power. It's a major power to deal with. And I think there's these kind of policies sometimes to confront the West are mechanisms for Russia to reassert itself, to say to the world, hey, we're not just a joke. You have to take us seriously. So the second question or comment?
Oh, okay. So I think you did a great job kind of painting in broad strokes what's happening economically and politically. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening with the people? You know, the people in Crimea, the people in Eastern Ukraine. I mean, that's probably a little more nuanced than that, but what's going on?
Honestly, I haven't.
The only thing I can say, I think it's a wonderful question, and I really want you to address it. We give a bit of time crunch.
Yeah, we have to leave.
All completely out of the building in like 10 of.
Okay.
So I would
What is
like
it now?
to like, kind of wrap up in a couple of minutes.
7 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, so just
Okay.
wanna, yeah.
Honestly, I wouldn't be able to, not with the current circumstances, because obviously I don't have contact. Again, there's a lot. I mean, I did talk with some people, but one-sided mostly. So I wouldn't think that. I don't think that it would be a good idea to reflect it. But having that disclaimer, I would say surprisingly, there's a lot of apathy in the western side of Ukraine as well, in Kiev, by Ukrainians. The people I've talked, apathy meaning, you know, yeah, sure, whatever, we don't care. I mean, there's an apathy which is a manifestation of economic, you know, the disparity. People are, you know, it's a situation where I don't give a shit. You know, Eastern Ukraine is separating, I don't give a shit. You know, even if I'm trying to mobilize you by nationalism, you know, Ukraine has to stay together and so on. I think there's a deep-rooted apathy that they don't care. So I couldn't answer your second question. The gentleman and then.
We definitely won't have time to answer both of them, so.
Why don't I ask, why I think all the questions?
Will not.
I was just giving you a thumbs up to that answer, actually. I just wanted to say that, like, that response.
Thank you.
All right, so if we think about the options then for these eastern provinces in Ukraine, they would presumably include either joining Russia or gaining some degree of autonomy within Ukraine.
Within Ukraine, yeah.
Or simply just status quo, they just stay part of Ukraine.
That seems to be the trend in the former Soviet space. A lot of unrecognized republics. Unrecognized republics. Transnistria, for instance, in Moldova, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, in Georgia, Nagorno-Karabakh, in Armenia and Azerbaijan. This seems to be the norm. I think the problem is the longer this goes on, the more difficult it would be to reintegrate these parts into Ukraine. So the other option of status quo or some level of autonomy would be something to explore.
Putin will never allow the reintegration anyway. His whole idea is to create the same thing that he created with Georgia or Moldova with Sarabia.
The time factor is important. I mean, when I worked on Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the longer the conflict went on. At the beginning of a conflict, if you can end the conflict, and then you can say, you don't have that much of a bad luck. But the longer it goes on, the more victims, the more war, more conflict, it would be more difficult to Ukraine.
So the question was then, do we know what most of the people in this province actually want among those options?
It's the same answer that I gave earlier. I don't think so. I mean, at this point, it's just like making the soup. You don't know what it's going to come out. You're throwing so many things in it. You're not sure what's going to come out. And that's the situation, I think, in terms of, by the same token, there is no, one thing they're saying, we want to be part of Russia. But that's just maximum speed. But actually what Russia might be willing to do, or give up, or say, fine, we'll guarantee your safety as long as you're autonomous. I don't know what the official, there's no official, technically there is no official position by this week. Because there is no official. Yes,
Sorry, we have to officially wrap things up. You guys can certainly have a conversation, but I kind of need to.
Right, okay.
So.
Do you know how many people died in this home?
That's a good question. Does anyone know how many people? What are the number of casualties?
I know some statistics by gender.
Casualty.
Like 5 Russian journalists were dying and 40 kids.
What's that? In general. Good point. You're learning. You're using my line now.
Adam, nice to meet you. Aaron? Yes.
I would say that way around. A lot of people there.